A Thursday morning in early November, frost clinging to the edges of the world like it was trying to hold everything still. The town sat where the highway gave up, tucked behind a ridge that blocked cell signals and swallowed ambition. 24 buildings, a gas station with one working pump, and a diner with no name on its awning, just a faded coffee cup painted on the glass like that was explanation enough. No one important came through Whetstone. That was the point of it. That was why it existed at all. And yet, at exactly 7:15 that morning, a black car pulled off the road and parked at an angle that said the driver did not plan to stay long. The engine cut. The door opened. And the most feared man in 4 states stepped onto gravel that crunched under shoes worth more than most of the buildings on this street. Devon did not belong here. Everything about him said so. The cut of his coat, the stillness in his posture, the way his eyes moved across the street in a single sweep that cataloged every exit, every sightline, every person within reach before he took a second step. Men like him did not eat at diners without names. Men like him did not stop in towns the world had already forgotten. But the highway had been closed 9 miles back, a jackknifed truck across both lanes, and the detour had pulled him through country roads that narrowed into something barely paved until this place appeared like something the fog had coughed up. He pushed through the door. A bell above it rang once, thin and tired. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with the smell of coffee that had been sitting too long and bacon grease that had seeped into the walls over decades. 4 booths along the window. A counter with 6 stools. An older man reading a newspaper near the back. A woman and her teenage son sharing a plate of eggs near the door. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that warranted a second glance. He sat at the far booth, the one that gave him a view of both the entrance and the kitchen pass, habit so deep it required no thought. His phone buzzed in his pocket, then again, then once more. He ignored it. His men were still on the highway. He had 20 minutes, maybe less, before they caught up. The waitress came from the kitchen without hurry. Apron tied at the waist, hair pulled back with a pencil threaded through it, sleeves pushed to her elbows. She moved the way people move when they have done the same thing 1,000 mornings in a row, steady, practiced, invisible by design. She set a menu in front of him without looking up. Coffee is fresh. Specials are on the board. Her voice was low, calm, and unremarkable. She turned to walk away. Something caught. Not in his mind, not yet, but somewhere deeper. A flicker. Faint and shapeless, like a word you almost remember but cannot quite reach. He looked at her back as she moved toward the counter, at the way she held herself, the particular angle of her shoulders, the way her left hand rested at her side with the fingers slightly curled. He frowned, not in recognition, but in the space just before it. She brought the coffee 2 minutes later, set it down with a steadiness that betrayed nothing, and placed the check beside it. Face down. He hadn't ordered food. He hadn't asked for the check. But she was already walking away again, and something about the way she moved this time was different. Faster, tighter, like the air behind her was closing in. He reached for the coffee first, then the check. He turned it over. A folded piece of paper, small, torn from an order pad, tucked beneath the printed total. He opened it with one hand, expecting nothing, and the world fell out from under him. The handwriting was small, pressed hard into the paper, the letters sharp and tilted to the left, the way only one person he had ever known wrote. 5 lines. No greeting, no signature. I know you did not come here by accident. Whatever they told you, whatever you were sent to finish, I am begging you. Leave. The children have never heard your name. Do not make me disappear again. His hand stopped. His breath stopped. His pulse, which had not risen in rooms where men pointed loaded weapons at his chest, slammed against his ribs so hard it blurred his vision. He read it again. Then again. Each time the words hit differently, rearranging themselves into something more impossible than before. Children, disappear again. That handwriting. He looked up. The counter was empty. The kitchen door was still swinging on its hinges. He stood too fast. The booth scraped across the floor. The older man near the back glanced up. Devon didn't notice. He crossed the diner in 4 strides, pushed through the kitchen door, and found nothing. A back exit, still open, cold air rushing through it, a coat missing from the hook on the wall. She was gone. He stood in that kitchen, breathing hard, the note crushed in his fist, and for the first time in years, something inside him broke open that he did not know how to close. Because that handwriting belonged to Senna, and Senna had been dead for 3 years. He did not leave Whetstone. He could not. His men called 6 times before he shut the phone off entirely. The car stayed where he had parked it, engine cold, while he walked the town on foot like a man relearning how to see. The main street was 4 blocks long, the bakery at one end, the post office at the other, and in between the sort of small, ordinary life that does not leave traces in any system he controlled. He found her by following the only logic that made sense. She would live close to where she worked. She would choose somewhere with a back door. She would stay where she could see who was coming before they arrived. The diner itself had all 3. A narrow staircase on the side of the building led to a second floor he hadn't noticed from inside, and above it, a window with curtains drawn, but not completely. He stood across the street in the shadow of a storefront awning and watched. Movement behind the curtain. A shape. Small. Quick. Then another. Slower. Trailing the first. Shadows too short to belong to an adult, moving with the careless rhythm of something that had never been taught to hide. Children. The word from the note became real in his chest like a wound reopening. His jaw clenched. His hands, the same hands that had signed orders worth more than this entire town, curled at his sides and would not stop shaking. He crossed the street, climbed the narrow stairs besides the building, reached the door at the top and knocked, before he could convince himself not to. Silence. Then footsteps, quick and deliberate, and a muffled voice he could not hear clearly. A child's question cut short. Another set of footsteps, heavier, slower, coming closer with a reluctance that sounded like dread. The door opened 4 inches, held by a chain. Her face appeared in the gap, and everything he thought he understood about the last 3 years collapsed into rubble. She was older, thinner. Her hair was darker than he remembered, cut shorter, falling around a face that had sharpened with years of something far harder than time. But it was her. The same jaw, the same way her mouth set when she was holding back something that wanted to tear its way out. The same eyes that once looked at him like he was the only safe place in the world. Those eyes looked at him now with pure terror, not anger, not coldness, not the guarded resentment of someone wronged. Terror. The kind that lives in the body long before the mind catches up, that makes hands tremble and breath come shallow and every muscle prepare for what might happen next. You found us. Her voice barely carried through the gap. Senna. His voice cracked on her name like it had forgotten how to hold it. You need to leave. She was already pushing the door shut. Please, whatever you came for, it is not here. I didn't come for anything. I didn't know you were... He couldn't finish. The word alive sat in his throat like something jagged and impossible. Behind her, through the narrow gap, he saw them. A girl, maybe 3 years old, standing in the hallway with wide dark eyes and a fistful of crayons, watching him with a curiosity that had no fear in it. And beside her, partly hidden by the doorframe, a boy, same age and same face, but quieter, stiller. His gaze locked on Devon with an intensity that should not exist in someone so small. The girl's hair caught the hallway light. A shade so specific, so unmistakable, that his entire body went rigid. Amber. The same deep bronze that ran through his family line like a signature no one could forge. His lungs emptied. The hallway tilted. 3 years of grief, of funeral arrangements, of staring at a headstone with her name carved into it, and she was standing 4 inches away from him with his children behind her. Go. She said it like a prayer, like a threat, like the last word she had left. If you ever felt anything real, you will turn around and go. The door closed. The chain rattled. The lock turned with a sound that went through him like a blade. He stood there, forehead nearly touching the wood, breathing in shallow bursts that fogged in the cold air. On the other side, he heard her moving, quick and practiced, the sound of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment in her mind 1,000 times. Then a child's voice, small and clear. "Mama, why are you crying?" Silence. Is it because of the man at the door? More silence. Then Senna's voice, thinner than he had ever heard it. "He's not a man, baby. He's a ghost." And on the other side of that door, the ghost lowered himself to the floor, sat with his back against the frame, and pressed his hands over his face because the woman he had buried was alive, his children existed, and she was afraid of him for reasons he could not begin to understand. He did not move. He would not move. Not until she told him why. The night I died began with something so ordinary it still makes me sick to think about. A Tuesday, dinner on the stove, music playing low from the speaker in the kitchen because silence in that house always felt like it was listening. I was setting the table for 2 when I heard the office door open down the hall, and Rask's voice carried through the corridor the way it always did, smooth and deliberate, a man who measured every syllable before he let it leave his mouth. I should have kept setting the table. I should have stayed in that kitchen and stirred the pot and pretended I heard nothing, the way I had trained myself to do since the first month of my marriage. But the tone was wrong. Rask spoke to everyone with a practiced calm that made you feel like you were being managed instead of spoken to. With Devon, he was careful, deferential, and loyal in a way that never wavered. Tonight, though, there was something loose in his voice, something that sounded like certainty, the sort that belongs to a man who has already made his decision and is simply informing the room. I moved closer, not because I wanted to hear, because something in my chest told me I needed to. The office door was not fully closed. It almost never was when Devon was not inside, and Devon was not inside. He was across the city that night, handling a negotiation that had demanded his personal attention. Rask was supposed to be with him. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. I stopped beside the door. Rask was on the phone, his back to me, one hand resting on Devon's desk like it belonged there. I caught pieces. Numbers that sounded like account transfers. A name I recognized as belonging to the Kazan family, a rival operation that had circled Devon's territory for years without ever having the nerve to strike directly. And then a sentence that severed something inside me that I did not know could be cut. The transfer completes Thursday. Once his accounts are rerouted, the Kazans move on the eastern ports. He won't see it until it's done, and by then, the board answers to us, not him. I stopped breathing. My hand found the wall beside me and pressed flat against it as if the house might tilt and throw me to the floor. Rask was selling him out, not in the future, not as a contingency, but now, actively, with a timeline and a structure and the confidence of a man who had been building this for months, maybe longer. Everything I was hearing pointed to the same conclusion. The person Devon trusted more than anyone in his organization was dismantling it from the inside, and by Thursday, it would be too late to stop. I moved before I could think. Down the hall, past the kitchen, reaching for my phone with hands that shook so badly I nearly dropped it twice. Devon needed to know. That was the only thought in my head. Devon needed to hear this before the walls closed in. I never made the call. The hand came from behind me, fast and practiced, catching my wrist and twisting it just enough to send the phone clattering to the tile floor. I turned and Rask stood there, his expression unchanged, his eyes locked on mine with the calm patience of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome of this moment and found not a single one that worried him. "You shouldn't have been listening, Senna." My pulse roared in my ears. I tried to pull free, but his grip held firm, not enough to bruise, just enough to make it clear that struggling would cost me more than holding still. "I'm calling Devon." My voice came out steadier than I felt. He smiled. It was the worst thing I had ever seen on a human face because it held nothing behind it. No malice, no rage, just the blank certainty of a man looking at a problem he had already solved. "No," he said. "You're not." What happened in the next hour came in fragments that I have spent 3 years trying to arrange into something that makes sense. Two men I had never seen before appeared from the back corridor. Rask spoke to them in a voice too low for me to catch. My coat was brought to me, my arm guided toward the service entrance, and the whole time Rask spoke to me in that same measured tone, explaining carefully and without emotion that Devon already knew what he was doing, that this was not betrayal, but transition, and that my involvement in anything beyond my role as a silent wife had created a problem that needed to be resolved quietly. I didn't believe him. Not then. Not yet. The car they put me in was dark and unfamiliar. One man driving, the other beside me in the back seat, neither of them speaking. We left the estate through the back gate, the one the staff used, and turned onto roads I did not recognize. My mind raced through options, but my body stayed still because something primal in me understood that the wrong movement at the wrong time would end this permanently. The crash came 12 minutes later. I know that because the dashboard clock was the last thing I saw before the headlights behind us flared. A second vehicle materialized from a side road, and the world became noise, glass, impact, and then nothing. I woke in a ditch. That is the simplest way to say it. The car was 30 feet away, crumpled against a tree, one headlight still burning. The driver was slumped forward. The man from the back seat was gone, whether thrown or walked away, I never found out. Blood ran from my hairline into my left eye, hot and steady. My right shoulder screamed when I tried to push myself upright, and something in my ribs ground against itself with a pain so sharp it turned my vision white. But I was alive. I crawled before I walked. Then I walked before I could think. The road behind me glowed faintly from the wreck, and every step I took made that glow smaller until it disappeared entirely, and I was alone on a dark road with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the spreading conviction that the man I loved had just tried to kill me, because that is what Rask wanted me to believe. And in that moment, terrified and bleeding and so far from anything safe that the word had lost all meaning, I believed it completely. If Devon knew what Rask was doing, then Devon knew I had overheard. And if Devon knew I had overheard, then the car, the men, the crash, all of it pointed in one direction. My husband wanted me dead. That was the lie I carried into the dark with me. That was the lie that kept me running when my legs gave out. That kept me silent when every instinct screamed for help, that kept me from calling anyone, trusting anyone, stopping anywhere that might lead back to a life that had already decided I did not belong in it. And somewhere behind me, in a room full of power and carefully constructed loyalty, a man named Rask sat at a desk that was not his, made a phone call to a number that should not have existed in his contacts, and said 6 words that sealed everything. "It's done. She won't be a problem." I did not go to a hospital. Hospitals ask questions, leave records, make calls. A woman with crash injuries arriving alone at 2 in the morning would trigger systems that I could not afford to activate. Not when the man I was running from had access to every system that mattered. Instead, I walked, then stumbled, then half crawled along the shoulder of a road that didn't appear on the signposts, following the yellow center line like it was the only reliable thing left in the world. My ribs sent bright jolts of pain through my chest with every breath. The cut on my hairline had slowed to a thick ooze that matted my hair against my temple. My shoulder hung at an angle that told me something was wrong inside it, something I did not have the luxury of understanding yet. Distance was the only medicine I trusted. Every step between me and that wreck was a step between me and the life that had just tried to swallow me whole. I counted them the way a drowning person counts breaths, not because it helped, but because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean feeling, and feeling would have put me on the ground for good. A gas station appeared sometime around 4 in the morning, the kind that exists between nowhere and nothing. One fluorescent light buzzing above 2 pumps and a bathroom that required no key. I locked myself inside, ran cold water over the cut on my head until the bleeding stopped, and used paper towels to strap my ribs tight enough that breathing became manageable instead of blinding. The face in the mirror was someone I did not recognize. Pale, hollow, streaked with dried blood and dirt, eyes flat with the sort of shock that does not shake or cry, but simply goes quiet and waits for instructions from a brain that has temporarily stopped issuing them. I stared at that face and made the only decision that mattered. I would not die tonight, and I would not go back. Cash. I had cash. Not much. A few hundred folded into the lining of my coat from a habit my mother taught me years before I married into a world that made such precautions feel unnecessary. It was enough for a bus ticket bought at a counter where the clerk barely looked up, enough for a seat in the back row beside a window that rattled with every mile, enough to carry me further from everything I knew with each passing hour. I changed buses twice. Once in a station so crowded no one noticed the woman in the dirty coat who sat in the corner and didn't speak. Once more in a town I couldn't name, where the schedule posted on the wall had a route heading northwest into mountain country, into the kind of terrain that swallows people who want to be swallowed. By the second day, my ribs had settled into a deep, constant ache that I learned to breathe around. My shoulders still wouldn't lift above my chest, but I could move it enough to carry the single bag I had bought at a secondhand store along the way. New clothes, nothing expensive, nothing memorable. A hat to cover the cut on my head. Everything chosen to make me look like exactly what I needed to become. No one. The bus dropped me at the edge of Whetstone on a Wednesday afternoon that smelled like pine sap and cold water. The town looked the way places look when the world has agreed to leave them alone. A main street with buildings that leaned slightly, a river running close enough to hear, mountains on 3 sides like a wall built by something older than people. I stood at the edge of it with my bag over my good shoulder and waited for the feeling that I had gone far enough. It didn't come. I'm not sure it ever would. But my legs had stopped cooperating, my vision kept graying at the edges, and the truth was simple. I could not take another step. The diner was the first door I reached. Not by choice, just by proximity. I pushed through it, and the warmth hit me so hard my knees almost buckled. Coffee, grease, bread, sounds of forks on plates, and low conversation. The mundane machinery of a life I had forgotten existed. The woman behind the counter was somewhere past 60, with hands that looked like they had never been idle, and eyes that moved across me once, top to bottom, reading everything I was trying to hide in a single glance. "You look like you've had a week," she said. "I've had a life," I replied without thinking. Something shifted in her expression. Not pity. Recognition, maybe? The sort that comes from having survived your own version of whatever you are seeing in someone else. "I need help in the mornings," she said. "5 days a week. Pays not much, but the room upstairs comes with it." I didn't ask about the room. I didn't negotiate the pay. I said yes before the word had fully formed because my body was shutting down and my mind was running out of places to redirect the pain. And this woman, whose name I would later learn was Dorrit, had just offered me the one thing no amount of money or power had ever been able to guarantee: a place to stop. The room above the diner was small enough that I could touch both walls if I stretched my arms. A bed, a chair, a window that looked out onto the main street below. I locked the door, lowered myself onto the mattress, and lay perfectly still because moving hurt, breathing hurt, and somewhere beneath all of it, buried so deep I could barely feel it, something else was beginning to hurt, in a way that had nothing to do with broken ribs. I had loved him. That was the thing I could not outrun. I had loved him completely, built my entire sense of safety around his presence, handed him parts of myself that I would never get back, and he had sent men to kill me. That thought sat on my chest like a stone, heavier than the cracked ribs, heavier than the miles I had put between us, heavier than anything I had carried in my life. I closed my eyes and let Whetstone settle around me like a blanket pulled over the head of a child who is too tired to be afraid anymore. Tomorrow, I would learn the rhythm of the diner, the names of the regulars, the particular way Dorrit folded towels and expected them folded in return. Tomorrow, I would begin the slow, deliberate work of becoming someone who had never existed before. But tonight, in the silence of a room that belonged to no one and therefore could belong to me, I let myself feel it. All of it. The terror, the heartbreak, the savage disbelief that the person I trusted most in the world had looked at my life and decided it was a problem to be solved. I did not cry. Crying requires a kind of hope that something might change, and nothing was going to change. Instead, I lay there, breathing carefully around the damage, and made myself a promise that I sealed into the walls of that small room like mortar between bricks. No one would ever have that kind of power over me again. And by morning, the woman called Sene was gone. In her place, a waitress named Nell started her first shift, poured her first coffee, and smiled at a customer for the first time in what felt like another person's life. The disguise was not a wig or a new face. It was something simpler and far more complete. She became ordinary, and ordinary, in a world that only hunts what it can see, was the most dangerous thing she could have possibly become. Weeks passed before my body stopped reminding me of what had happened to it. The ribs healed first, slowly, in stages that went from blinding pain to dull ache, to a tenderness that only surfaced when I reached too high or laughed too suddenly. The shoulder took longer. Dorrit noticed me favoring it on the third day and said nothing, just moved the heavier supply crates to the lower shelf without comment, and let me work the register instead of the kitchen when the mornings got busy. She never asked what had happened to me. I think she understood that the answer would either be a lie or something neither of us was ready to carry. The diner had a rhythm that became my scaffolding. 5 in the morning, the oven's on, the coffee started, and the front wiped down before the first regulars came through the door. Breakfast ran until 10. Lunch until 2. By 3, the place was empty, and the afternoon stretched out in a silence that should have felt lonely, but instead felt earned, like the quiet that follows a held breath. I learned the names of the people who came in every day. Harlan, who sat at the counter every morning and read the same dog-eared paperback with no apparent intention of ever finishing it. Odette, who ran the post office and always ordered tea, but drank coffee when she thought no one was watching. Wynne, the mechanic 2 doors down, who spoke 6 words a day, and 4 of them were thank you. They treated me the way they treated everything in Whetstone, with a steady, undemanding kindness that expected nothing in return except the same. I gave them Nell, I gave them a woman who smiled at the right moments, remembered their orders, and kept the tables clean and the conversation light. It was not a performance. It was a burial. Everything I had been before, the name, the marriage, the world of locked gates and guarded hallways, I pressed it down into the lowest part of myself and built a new floor over it, thick enough to walk on without hearing what was underneath. Dorrit watched me the way she watched bread rise, with a patience that understood some things cannot be rushed. Once, after the diner closed on a Saturday, she poured 2 glasses of something she kept behind the flour bin and sat across from me at the counter. "You don't have to tell me where you came from," she said. "But if someone comes looking, I'd like to know whether to lie or call the sheriff." I looked at her for a long time. The answer I gave was the most honest thing I had said to anyone in weeks. "If someone comes looking," I said, "the sheriff won't help." She nodded slowly, turned her glass once in her hand, and drank. That was the end of the conversation, but something changed between us after that. She started locking the back door at night, something she told me she hadn't done in 11 years. She moved the cash box to a different spot each week. Small things, practical things, the quiet machinery of a woman who had decided to protect something without needing to understand it fully. I let myself believe, cautiously and with a hope that felt more like a wound than a comfort, that I might actually survive this. The town kept its distance in the way that small places do when they have decided someone belongs. No questions, no suspicion, just a gradual settling, like snow filling in footprints until the ground looks untouched. I became part of Whetstone's routine. The morning waitress who opened early, who kept the coffee strong, who once fixed the jukebox with a screwdriver and a patience that impressed even when nobody looked at me the way people used to. Nobody saw power when they looked in my direction. Nobody saw a wife, a trophy, a vulnerability to be exploited. They saw Nell, and Nell was no one, and no one was exactly who I needed to be. But safety, I was learning, is not a permanent state. It is a season, and seasons change without asking permission. The nausea started on a Monday, 6 weeks after I arrived. It hit me mid-pour, a wall of dizziness so sudden that the coffee pot slipped in my hand and I barely caught it before it shattered on the floor. I grabbed the counter edge, held myself there until the room stopped rotating, and told Dorrit it was something I ate. She looked at me the way she looked at everything, like she could see the parts I wasn't showing. "Go upstairs," she said. "I can handle the morning." I didn't argue. The stairs felt steeper than they ever had, and by the time I reached the bathroom, the nausea had turned into something that emptied me completely, left me kneeling on the tile with my forehead against the cool porcelain and my hands shaking against my stomach. The next day, it happened again, and the day after that. And every morning for the rest of the week until the pattern became undeniable and the denial became impossible. The pharmacy in Whetstone was a single aisle inside the general store, tucked between cleaning supplies and canned goods. I bought the test with cash, didn't meet the clerk's eyes, and walked home with it in my coat pocket like it was something that could detonate. It could. I sat on the edge of the bathtub at 4 in the morning, a full hour before my shift, and watched 2 lines appear with a certainty that left no room for bargaining. The result was absolute. There was no version of this that could be explained away, no angle from which it looked like anything other than exactly what it was. I was pregnant. With his child. The realization moved through me in stages. First, the numbness. Familiar. Automatic. My body's learned response to anything that threatened to overwhelm. Then something sharper beneath it, cutting through the blankness like a wire pulled taut. Not just pregnant. Pregnant and hiding. Pregnant and alone. Pregnant with a child whose father believed I was dead, and whose father, I believed, had tried to make that true. I pressed my hands flat against my stomach like I could feel something already, like the proof would be tactile, immediate, and undeniable in a way the plastic stick could not be. There was nothing yet. Just warmth and the faintest flutter that might have been my own pulse or might have been something else entirely. Every calculation I had made since leaving that wreck on the roadside suddenly needed to be redone. Every plan, every precaution, every careful layer of anonymity I had built was now worth exactly half of what it had been, because I was no longer hiding one life, I was hiding two. And the terrifying thing, the thing that kept me sitting on that bathtub edge long after the test had confirmed what my body already knew, was that this child was a thread. A living, growing, unbreakable thread connecting me to the one person I had sworn to never be connected to again. If he ever found out, it would not matter how far I had run or how well I had hidden or how completely I had erased myself from his world. A child changes the math. A child makes the search permanent. I sat there until the light through the bathroom window shifted from black to gray to pale gold, and by the time I stood, something had rearranged itself inside me. Not calm, not acceptance. Something harder, something older, the same instinct that had pulled me from a ditch and put me on a bus and carried me to this forgotten town at the end of a road nobody traveled. I would protect this, whatever it cost, whatever it required. However many times I had to become someone new, I would protect this. And no one, not Rask, not Devon, not the entire machinery of that world I had left behind, would ever get close enough to take it from me. The months that followed taught me that a body can do two things at once that seem impossible when placed side by side. It can heal while it grows. It can carry the damage from one life while building the architecture for another. My ribs had fully mended by the time my stomach began to show, and there was something almost cruel in the timing, like one wound closing just as another kind of vulnerability opened in its place. Dorrit figured it out before I told her. I came downstairs one morning in a shirt that no longer hid what was happening underneath, and she looked at me once, set a glass of milk on the counter next to my coffee, and went back to rolling dough. No questions, no judgment, just milk, every morning after that, and a second pillow that appeared on my bed without explanation. I worked as long as my body allowed. The regulars noticed gradually, the way small towns notice everything, through silence and careful observation and the occasional unsolicited gift left on the counter. A pair of knitted socks from Odette. A second-hand crib that appeared in the hallway one afternoon with no note attached, though Wynn's truck had been parked outside that morning and his knuckles had fresh scratches on them. No one asked who the father was. In Whetstone, the things you didn't say were protected with the same diligence as the things you did. I found the doctor on my own. 30 miles east, a small clinic attached to a hospital that served 3 counties and ran on the sort of underfunding that meant files were kept in paper folders and digital records lagged months behind. I gave them Nell's name, paid cash, drove Dorrit's truck on the mountain roads with my hands gripping the wheel and my heart beating too fast every time another vehicle appeared in the mirror. The first ultrasound was routine, the doctor said. A formality. She pressed the device against my stomach and stared at the screen with a focus that sharpened into something I couldn't read. Have you had any ultrasounds before this one? No. She turned the screen toward me and pointed to 2 shapes, distinct, separate, curled into themselves like 2 questions waiting to be asked. You're carrying twins. The room didn't move, but I did. Something inside my chest dropped with a weight that pinned me to the examination table and would not let me rise. Twins. Not one child to hide, to name, to protect. 2. 2 lives growing inside a body that had barely survived its own escape. 2 reasons for a man with limitless resources to tear the world apart looking. I stared at the screen and felt the mathematics of my survival shift into something I was no longer sure I could solve. They came 5 weeks early. I woke at 3 in the morning to a pain that started in my lower back and wrapped around my body like a belt being tightened by a hand I couldn't see. The room was dark. The town was silent. I lay there for 10 minutes trying to convince myself it was nothing, that the doctor had said I had weeks left, that my body was simply reminding me of the weight it carried. The second contraction ended that argument. It came harder, faster, with a force that bent me forward and stole the air from my lungs before I could call for help. I made it to the stairs. Dorrit heard me before I reached the bottom, her door opening, her voice cutting through the dark with the sharp clarity of someone who had lived long enough to know what urgency sounds like. "How far apart?" she asked before she even saw my face. "Minutes," I managed. She didn't hesitate. Coat on, keys grabbed, truck running before I had reached the passenger door. The drive to the clinic took 40 minutes on roads that wound through mountains like they were trying to keep the world out. Dorrit drove the way she did everything, steady and certain, talking to me the whole way in a voice that gave me something to hold on to while the contractions tried to pull me under. We made it. Barely. The nurses moved fast once they saw me, and the next hour dissolved into a blur of fluorescent light, voices calling instructions, hands guiding me through something my body had decided to do whether I was ready or not. The girl came first. She arrived the way a storm arrives, sudden, loud, and impossible to ignore. Her first cry filled the delivery room with a sound so fierce that one of the nurses actually laughed. A startled, involuntary sound that broke through the tension like sunlight through a cracked wall. They placed her on my chest and she opened her eyes almost immediately, dark and furious and already searching, like she had arrived with a list of demands and no intention of waiting. But her hair, even in those first seconds, damp and pressed to her tiny scalp, it held a color that knocked the breath out of me. Amber. Deep. Warm. Unmistakable. The exact shade I had spent 6 months trying to forget, the shade that ran through his bloodline like a watermark, visible only when the light hit it right, but impossible to deny once you saw it. I touched it with trembling fingers and felt the thread I had been running from tighten around my heart. The boy came 11 minutes later, quieter, calmer, entering the world with a small deliberate sound that was less a cry and more an announcement. Where his sister had arrived demanding, he arrived assessing, his eyes opening slowly, blinking once, twice, and then settling on my face with a focus that made my chest ache. His hair was dark, nearly black, and his features were fine and sharp in a way that would only become more pronounced with time. He looked like me, not entirely, not completely, but enough that I could see my own face reflected back in something brand new. 2 children, 2 lives. I held them both, one in each arm, and felt the full, crushing weight of what this meant settle into me like concrete poured into the foundation of a building that could never be moved. I named the girl Veda because it means knowledge, and she had arrived already knowing exactly who she was. I named the boy Leith because it means flowing water. And even in those first minutes, he carried a stillness that ran deep in a way you could feel but not see. Dorrit stood in the doorway of the recovery room with her coat still on and her keys still in her hand, looking at me the way someone looks at a person who has just done something both miraculous and terrifying. 2, she said quietly. 2, I repeated. She nodded once, the way she always did when the truth was too large for more than a single gesture. I looked down at them. Veda had already found my shirt, her small fist gripping the fabric with a strength that seemed impossible for something so new. Leith lay still beside her, his breathing slow and even, his hand resting against my arm like he was anchoring us both to something he understood better than I did. They were beautiful. They were dangerous. They were the 2 most incriminating pieces of evidence I would ever carry, Proof that I had once belonged to a man whose world I could never return to, written into their skin and bones and blood in a language that could not be erased. And yet, holding them, feeling the impossible lightness and impossible weight of them at the same time, I understood something that rearranged every priority I had. I was no longer running from him, I was running for them. And that made me more dangerous than anything his world had ever produced, because a woman protecting herself can be convinced to stop. A mother protecting her children cannot. The funeral was held on a Friday. He remembers that because Fridays had been hers. She used to cook on Friday evenings, something slow and complicated that filled the entire estate with warmth and sound, and he would come home to find her barefoot in the kitchen, music playing, a glass of wine half finished on the counter. It was the only night of the week the house felt like a home instead of a fortress. They buried an empty casket. Rask had explained, with the careful steadiness that made him indispensable, that the body had been recovered in a condition that made identification difficult. Dental records confirmed it. Documents were signed. The formalities of death moved forward with a machinery that left no space for the sort of questions a grieving man does not think to ask. Devon stood at the graveside and felt something leave his body that he would not be able to name for years. Not strength, not control. Something beneath those things. Something foundational, like the ground floor of a building being pulled out while everything above it was expected to remain standing. He did not cry. Men in his position do not cry, not because they are incapable of it, but because the world around them cannot afford the instability it would signal. Instead, he went quiet in a way that unsettled everyone who knew him. The sharp, decisive mind that had built an empire across 4 states went still, turned inward, and focused on a single point of pain that no amount of power could reach. Rask handled the aftermath. Of course he did. He was always there, always steady, always ready to step into whatever space needed filling. In the weeks that followed, he presented evidence, carefully assembled and impossible to dispute, that the Kazan family had ordered the hit. The proof was meticulous. Phone records, intercepted communications, a witness who confirmed the vehicle that had run her car off the road belonged to a Kazan associate. Devon did not question it. He had no reason to. Rask had been beside him for 9 years, had bled for the operation, and had earned a level of trust that sat beyond suspicion. And grief is a kind of blindness that does not announce itself. It simply narrows the world until only 2 things remain: the pain and the target. He went after the Kazans with a precision that became the subject of whispered conversations across every territory that mattered. Not quickly, not carelessly, he disassembled them the way a man takes apart a clock, piece by piece, spring by spring, until the mechanism that once held it together could never be reconstructed. It took 14 months. When it was over, the Kazan name had been erased from every ledger, every alliance, and every conversation that carried weight. It should have helped. It did not. Because revenge only works when it reaches the right target, and Devon had just destroyed the wrong one. The years that followed did not soften him. They hollowed him. He ran the operation with the same efficiency, the same control, the same measured authority that had always defined him. But the people closest to him noticed what the outside world could not. He stopped eating at the estate, stopped entering the kitchen entirely, stopped playing music in any room she had once occupied. The house became what it had always been without her: a building, nothing more. Rask rose steadily during this period, filling the spaces Devon's grief had vacated. More responsibility, more access, more control over the daily machinery of the empire. No one questioned it. The man was loyal. The man was capable. The man had been there when everything fell apart and had held things together when Devon could not. That was the version of events that held for nearly 3 years. Solid, uncontested, built on grief too deep to see past and trust too old to examine. And then, on an ordinary Wednesday, in a room that smelled like old paper and stale coffee, a single thread came loose, and the entire fabric began to unravel. It started with money. It almost always does. A forensic accountant Devon had hired for an unrelated matter flagged a series of transfers that did not align with any known operation. Small amounts, routed through shell accounts, originating from a source that traced back, not to an external partner or a rival, but to an internal account Rask had managed for years. On its own, it was nothing. A clerical anomaly, a misrouted payment, the sort of thing that gets corrected with a phone call and a signature. But Devon had not survived this long by dismissing things that did not fit. He pulled the thread. What came next took 4 months to uncover, not because the evidence was hidden well, but because it was hidden by someone who understood exactly how Devon's systems worked, where the blind spots lived, which records were audited and which were not. Rask had not just stolen from the operation, he had redesigned parts of it, quietly, over years, rerouting revenue streams, building parallel structures, creating a shadow version of the empire that answered to him while the visible one continued to answer to Devon. The Kazan connection surfaced 3 weeks into the investigation, not as enemies, as partners. Rask had been working with them, not against them. The war Devon had waged, the 14 months of systematic destruction, had not been justice. It had been Rask eliminating his own co-conspirators before they could become liabilities. Devon sat with that information for 2 days. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He sat in the same chair in the same room and let the implications assemble themselves into a shape he could no longer deny. If Rask had been working with the Kazans, then the evidence against them had been manufactured. If the evidence had been manufactured, then the Kazans had not killed Senna. And if the Kazans had not killed her, then the question that had been sealed shut for 3 years blew wide open. Who did? He brought Rask in on a Thursday evening under the pretense of reviewing quarterly operations. The room was the same one where decisions that shaped cities had been made, where alliances were forged and enemies were ended. Rask sat across from him with the same composed expression he always wore. The same measured calm, the same loyal readiness. Devon placed a single folder on the table. Inside it, account records, transfer logs, communication intercepts, and a photograph of Rask meeting with a Kazan lieutenant in a restaurant that officially did not exist. Rask looked at the folder, then at Devon. And for the first time in 9 years, something behind his eyes shifted. The conversation that followed was not loud. It did not need to be. Devon asked questions with the patience of a man who already knew every answer and was simply confirming how many lies he had been living inside. Rask resisted at first, deflected, offered explanations that dissolved under the weight of evidence that could not be argued away. Then, when the architecture of denial had exhausted itself, the truth came. The night Senna had died, the car, the men, the crash. All of it orchestrated not by the Kazans, not by an outside enemy, but by the man sitting 3 feet away from him. Senna had overheard Rask's operation. She had tried to warn Devon, and Rask had removed her before the warning could land. "You told me she was dead," Devon said. His voice did not rise. It lowered, which was worse. "She was supposed to be." The room went silent with a finality that had nothing to do with sound. Supposed to be. Not confirmed. Not verified. Not certain. Supposed to be. The implication detonated inside him with a force that made the grief of 3 years feel like a prelude. Because if she was supposed to be dead but Rask could not confirm it, then there was a chance, thin and fragile, and almost too dangerous to hold, that she was not. What happened to Rask after that conversation is not something that belongs in detail. It was thorough. It was final. and it carried a weight that went beyond punishment into something closer to erasure. The systematic removal of a man who had stolen not just money or power, but 3 years of a life that could never be returned. When it was over, Devon stood in the same room, alone, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he thought he knew, and faced a question that terrified him more than anything ever had. Was she alive? And if she was, where had she been all this time? He searched the way a man searches when he has been given back the possibility of something he had already buried. Not with patience, not with strategy, with a desperate, consuming urgency that stripped away everything else until the search itself became the only thing that kept him upright. Every resource he had was redirected: trackers, investigators, analysts who specialized in finding people who did not want to be found. He reconstructed the night of the crash from the beginning, pulling apart every detail Rask had provided and replacing it with what could actually be verified. The crash site was located, the vehicle recovered, and the evidence told a story that was different from the one he had been sold. One body in the driver's seat, the passenger side empty, the rear door open. She had walked away. That confirmation changed everything and nothing at the same time. She was alive, or she had been alive 3 years ago. But the trail ended at that roadside ditch. No hospital records matching her description. No credit card activity, no phone signals, no digital footprint of any kind. She had vanished with a completeness that spoke not of luck, but of intention, of someone who understood how tracking worked and had systematically denied every avenue of it. Months passed. His people searched in widening circles, chasing leads that evaporated, following threads that led nowhere, checking towns and cities and transit records across 6 states. Nothing. She had become invisible in a world that made invisibility nearly impossible, and each dead end reinforced a truth he was only beginning to accept. She had not just run from Rask. She had run from him. Whatever Rask had told her that night, whatever lie had been planted alongside the violence, she believed that Devon was part of it. She believed the man she had married wanted her dead. That understanding lodged itself in his chest like something swallowed that could not be digested. Every day she was missing was a day she spent believing he had tried to kill her. Every day was a day the lie grew deeper, harder, and more permanent. He did not stop. He could not. But the search grew quieter, more personal, less like an operation and more like a vigil. He carried her photograph in his coat pocket, not the one from their public life, but a smaller one, taken on a morning she didn't know he was watching, her face turned toward a window, light catching her in a way that made her look like she belonged to a world gentler than the one she had married into. He looked at it more often than he would ever admit. And then, on an ordinary Thursday in November, a jackknifed truck closed the highway 9 miles outside of a town he had never heard of, and a detour pulled him down roads that narrowed and twisted through mountain country until a faded sign appeared through the windshield: Whetstone. He did not stop because he recognized it. He stopped because his fuel gauge was low, and the diner at the end of the street was the only thing open. An accident. A detour. A meaningless convergence of broken schedules and bad roads. He walked through the door expecting nothing. The bell rang. The air smelled like coffee and grease and bread. A waitress moved toward his table with a menu in her hand and a composure that belonged to someone who had practiced being invisible. She set the menu down. She did not look up. And everything that happened next, the note, the recognition, the children, the door that slammed between them, the cold floor where he sat and refused to leave, all of it began in that single ordinary moment when the most powerful man in 4 states sat down in a diner with no name and was handed a piece of paper that rearranged the entire architecture of his life. He had not come looking for her. The world had simply run out of ways to keep them apart. He did not leave the hallway outside her door that first night. His men found him the next morning, still sitting against the frame, coat damp from the cold that crept through the building's thin walls, his phone dead in his pocket. They had tracked his car, traced the detour, and arrived with the controlled urgency of people trained to expect the worst. He told them to leave. Not tomorrow. Now. Take the cars, go back to the city, and speak to no one. They hesitated. No one hesitated with Devon. Go, he said, and something in his voice ended the conversation. By noon, he had rented the only available space in Whetstone, a room above the hardware store at the far end of the main street. He paid Wynne 6 months in advance, cash, and asked for nothing except a key and to be left alone. Then he walked back to her building and sat on the bench across the street, in full view of her window, and waited. He did not approach the door again. He did not knock. He did not call up to the window or try to find her at the diner during her shift. He simply existed in her line of sight, visible, unarmed, patient in a way that contradicted everything anyone had ever known about him. Whetstone noticed immediately. A town that's small does not absorb a stranger without discussion, and a stranger, like Devon, with the posture and presence of a man who had lived his entire life being watched, generated the sort of quiet attention that traveled from kitchen to counter to porch without anyone raising their voice. Dorrit was the first to address it directly. She found Senna restocking the sugar dispensers on the second morning, hands steady but jaw set. "The man across the street," Dorrit said. "He was there when I opened. He was there when I went home last night." "I know. Is he the reason you don't use your real name?" Senna's hands paused on the dispenser. She didn't answer, which was answer enough. Dorrit wiped the counter once, slowly, the way she did when she was choosing her words carefully. "Do I need to make a call?" "No." Senna set the last dispenser down. "He won't do anything." "You sound certain." "I sound tired." And she was. The exhaustion that had taken hold of her since the moment she saw him in the diner had nothing to do with sleep, and everything to do with the weight of maintaining a fortress she had built alone, brick by brick, for 3 years. A fortress that now had a man sitting outside it who showed no intention of laying siege, no intention of breaking in, and no intention of walking away. That was what unnerved her most. She had prepared for violence. She had prepared for confrontation, for threats, for the machinery of power being brought down on her quiet life. She had not prepared for this. For silence. For patience. For a man who simply sat and waited as if time was something he had decided to give her instead of take from her. Veda broke the pattern on the 4th day. She had her mother's stubbornness and her father's inability to leave a thing unexamined. Senna had taken them to the small park behind the post office, the one with the rusted swing set and the wooden bench that Odette kept threatening to repaint. Devon was there, not close, not intrusive, sitting on the low stone wall at the edge of the park like he had chosen that spot for the view, and nothing else. Veda noticed him the way she noticed everything, immediately and without pretending otherwise. "That's the man from the door," she said, loud enough for the entire park to hear. "Yes." "He's still here." "Yes." "Why?" Because he found something he didn't know existed. Because the world he thought was real turned out to be made of lies. Because 3 years ago someone told him I was dead, and now he's sitting on a wall trying to understand how any of this is possible. "I don't know," Senna said. Veda studied him from across the park with the unfiltered scrutiny of a child who has not yet learned that staring is considered impolite. Then she turned back to her mother. "He looks like Leith." The observation landed with a precision that stole the air from Senna's lungs. She looked at her daughter, then at the man on the wall, and saw what a 3-year-old had seen in seconds: the jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the particular stillness that Leith carried in his body like something inherited rather than learned. Leith himself said nothing. He sat in the grass near the swings, pulling apart a dandelion with careful fingers, glancing up at Devon once, and then looking away, as if he had already gathered what he needed and was processing it in the quiet interior space where he kept everything that mattered. Days became a week. Devon's routine solidified into something Whetstone absorbed the way it absorbed weather, with acknowledgement but not resistance. He ate at the diner during off hours when Senna was not working. He walked the main street without purpose. He sat near the park when the children were there, never closer than 30 feet, never speaking, never reaching. Harlan, the man who read the same book every morning at the counter, finally walked over to the bench where Devon sat one afternoon and lowered himself down with the careful economy of someone whose knees had stopped cooperating years ago. "You're the most patient man I've ever seen," Harlan said. "Or the most stubborn." "Both." Harlan nodded, considering this. "She's good people, you know. Whatever happened between you two, she came here broken and put herself back together without asking anyone for help." Devon looked at him, and for a brief moment the mask he wore slipped just enough for Harlan to see something underneath that he had not expected. Not anger, not entitlement. Grief, raw and unfinished, belonging to a man who has only recently discovered that everything he grieved was a lie. "I know," Devon said quietly. Harlan studied him for a long moment, then stood, patted him once on the shoulder, and walked away without another word. Inside the diner, Senna watched through the window with her hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and felt something loosen inside her that she did not welcome and could not stop. Not trust, not forgiveness, but a question, small and dangerous, forming in the space between what she believed and what she was seeing. What if she was wrong? The question grew in silence. She did not speak it out loud, did not give it room to breathe, but it was there, present in every moment she watched him sit in the cold without demanding entry. In every afternoon she saw him near the park keeping a distance that cost him more than closing it ever would. The man she remembered would not have waited. The man she had married operated on certainty and action, on the principle that wanting something and taking it were separated by nothing more than a decision. That man would have knocked the door down on the first night, would have made demands, and would have treated her disappearance as a problem to be solved through force. This man sat on benches in the rain and let a 3-year-old stare at him from across a park without flinching. It didn't match. And things that don't match demand examination, no matter how much you wish they wouldn't. 2 weeks after he arrived, she stepped outside after closing the diner, walked across the street to where he sat on the bench beneath the hardware store awning, and stood in front of him with her arms crossed and her jaw set. He looked up. He didn't stand, didn't reach for her. Just waited. The way he had been waiting since the beginning. "You tried to kill me." The words came out flat, factual, delivered like a report. She had rehearsed them so many times in her head over 3 years that they had lost their heat and become something harder, something calcified. His reaction was not what she expected. His face didn't tighten with guilt. It didn't shift into defense or denial. It collapsed. The composure, the steadiness, the patience he had been wearing like armor for 2 weeks. All of it fell away at once, and what was left was something she had never seen on him before. Horror. "What?" The word came out barely above a whisper. "Rask told me you knew. That you ordered it. That I had heard too much and you decided I was a liability." She kept her voice even, though the effort cost her more than she would show. "His men put me in a car. The car crashed. I survived. And I've spent 3 years believing my own husband tried to have me killed." He stood then, not fast, not sudden, but with a slowness that looked like it hurt, like the act of standing required him to push through something far heavier than gravity. "Senna," his voice was destroyed, There was no other word for it. I buried you. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, packed with the weight of two entirely different versions of the same 3 years colliding in a space too small to hold them both. They told me you were dead, he continued, each word landing with visible effort. Rask brought evidence. Dental records, documents, and a casket I stood over on a Friday morning while everything inside me shut down. I mourned you. I waged a war against the Kazans because I believed they killed you. And the entire time, every single day of it, the man responsible was standing next to me, running my operations, filling the space you left. Her arms, still crossed, pressed harder against her chest. She searched his face for the lie, for the performance, for the careful construction of a man who had manipulated entire cities. She found nothing except a rawness that could not be manufactured. He played both of us, Devon said. He told you I wanted you dead. He told me you were dead. And we both believed it because we trusted him more than we should have. She shook her head, not in denial but in the frustration that comes when the ground you've been standing on for years reveals itself to be water. You're saying none of it was real. The car, the crash, the men who grabbed me. It was Rask. All of it. He was working with the Kazans, building a parallel operation, and you found out before he was ready. So he removed you and pointed me at the wrong enemy. His jaw flexed. I destroyed them. 14 months taking apart a family that had nothing to do with what happened to you, and Rask stood beside me the entire time. Where is he now? Gone. She understood the weight behind the word without needing elaboration. For a long time neither of them spoke. The street was empty. The town had gone to sleep. The only sound was the faint hum of the diner's refrigerator through the wall and the wind moving through the trees beyond the main road. 3 years, she said finally. The words carried everything she could not say directly. 3 years of raising children alone, of flinching at car engines, of sleeping with one ear always listening for footsteps that would mean the end. I know. You don't know. You can't. Her voice cracked for the first time, just a fraction, just enough for the pain to show through. I looked at our children every single day and saw your face, and every time I saw it, I remembered that their father wanted me dead. Do you understand what that does to a person? Loving 2 children completely and being terrified of the part of them that came from you? The sound he made was not a word. It was something involuntary, something that came from a depth he did not have language for. He pressed his hand over his mouth, then dropped it. And she saw that his eyes were wet in a way she had never witnessed in all the years she had known him. I didn't know they existed, he said. I didn't know you were alive. And every day I sat in a house that still smelled like you, and I couldn't enter the kitchen because Friday was yours and I couldn't. He stopped, steadied himself. The control came back, thin and fragile, but present. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he said. I'm not asking for anything. I just need you to know that I would have torn down every wall I ever built to keep you safe. And the one time it mattered, I didn't even know you needed me. She stood there, arms still crossed, breathing in a rhythm that she was consciously controlling because losing that rhythm meant losing the last barrier between composure and collapse. She didn't forgive him that night. Forgiveness was too large, too complex, too tangled in years of fear and survival to be offered on a sidewalk in the dark. But the certainty she had carried since that roadside ditch began to fracture, not enough to crumble, but enough to let in a sliver of light that had not been there before. She turned to go inside. At the door, she stopped. Leith has nightmares, she said quietly, not looking at him. Most nights he wakes up screaming and I can't reach him. He goes somewhere inside himself that I can't follow. Devon said nothing. He waited. If he wakes tonight, she said, and the words seemed to cost her something she would not get back. I'll leave the door unlocked. She went inside. The lock did not turn. He sat back down on the bench, hands clasped, breathing uneven, and understood that what she had just given him was not forgiveness. It was not trust. It was a test. And it was the most terrifying thing anyone had ever offered him. The call came at 2 in the morning, not a phone call, a sound. Leith's voice, sharp and broken, cutting through the silence of the building in a way that made the walls feel thin. He was up the stairs before the second cry. The door was unlocked, as she had said. He pushed through it and found Senna kneeling beside the small bed in the children's room, her hands on Leith's shoulders, her voice soft and steady and failing. The boy was somewhere else. His eyes were open, but they were not seeing her. His small body shook with a violence that seemed impossible for his size, and the sounds coming from him were not words, but something primal, something trapped. Devon knelt beside them. He didn't push Sene aside, didn't take over, and didn't do anything that claimed authority. He simply lowered himself to the boy's level, placed one hand flat against the mattress so Leith could feel the weight of it, and began speaking. Not words meant to be understood, not commands, not reassurance. Something lower, something rhythmic, a tone that came from a place he did not know he had, steady, patient, existing beneath language in the space where presence matters more than meaning. Leith's breathing changed, not immediately, slowly, like something letting go in stages. His eyes found Devon's face, focused and held. The shaking subsided, the small hands unclenched. And then, with the quiet certainty that belongs to children who have not yet learned to doubt what they feel, Leith reached out and pressed his hand flat against Devon's chest, directly over his heart, and left it there. Senna watched from beside them, one hand still on her son's back, her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and the place where she had been keeping every unshed tear for 3 years. This was what had been taken from them. Not just time, not just safety. This, the quiet, unremarkable moments where a father's presence means the difference between fear and peace, where a child reaches for something solid and finds it. Leith's eyes closed, his breathing settled. Sleep took him back gently, and his hand slid from Devon's chest to the blanket, still reaching, still holding on to something he had found. Devon did not move until he was certain the boy was fully asleep. Then he looked at Senna, and what passed between them in that silence was not a word or a decision or a resolution. It was recognition, the sort that exists only between two people who have survived the same lie from opposite sides and are only now beginning to see the full shape of what it cost them both. She exhaled. Long, slow, unsteady. "Stay," she said, and meant it in every way the word could be meant. There was no single moment when the broken thing between them became whole. No dramatic declaration, no grand act that erased the years. Instead, there was morning after morning where he was there when the children woke, afternoon after afternoon where his presence at the edge of their world moved gradually inward until the edge and the center became the same thing. Veda claimed him with the ferocity she brought to everything. She pulled him into her games, demanded he sit beside her at meals, introduced him to the worn stuffed rabbit she had named General, and informed him with absolute seriousness that General outranked him. He accepted this without argument. Leith took longer, but the nightmares began to thin, then space themselves out, then arrive so rarely that the nights between them felt like something new instead of something borrowed. On the evenings when sleep came easily, Leith would sit beside Devon on the floor and lean against his arm without speaking, and the silence between them held a warmth that words would have only diluted. Devon stayed in Whetstone, not temporarily, not as a visitor, but with the deliberate permanence of a man who had finally found the thing that mattered and refused to place anything between himself and it. The empire he had built was restructured, delegated, and reduced to something that could function without his daily presence. It was the first thing he had ever willingly released, and it cost him nothing that he missed. He fixed the railing on the diner stairs without being asked. He painted the kitchen a color Veda had chosen, a shade of yellow so aggressive that Dorrit said it looked like the sun had an argument with the walls and lost. He learned the rhythms of the diner, the names of the regulars, the particular way Dorrit expected the towels folded. And on the morning he showed up at 5 to help with the opening shift, Dorrit looked at him once, handed him an apron, and said, "You burn the toast, you're out." He did not burn the toast. Sen watched it all with the cautious attention of a woman who has learned that good things can be taken without warning. She did not rush. She did not pretend that 3 years of fear could be undone by 3 months of patience, but she stopped flinching when he was near. She stopped checking the locks twice. She stopped sleeping with one ear tuned to a danger that was no longer coming. On a Sunday in early spring, when the frost had finally released its grip on Whetstone and the river ran loud enough to hear from the main street, they stood together in the small yard behind the building where she had built her life without him. The children were chasing something between the clotheslines, Veda shouting orders, Leith following with the quiet smile he saved for moments when he thought no one was watching. Senna leaned against the railing. Devon stood beside her, close enough that their arms touched without either of them making a point of it. "I'm still afraid sometimes," she said, not as a confession, as a fact. "I know. Not of you, of how much I'm willing to trust again." He turned to look at her, and the face she saw was not the one the world feared. It was the one that sat on hallway floors and spoke in rhythms to calm a screaming child, and burned 0 pieces of toast because Dorrit's standards were apparently the one authority he was unwilling to challenge. "You don't have to trust all at once," he said. "Just enough for today." She looked at him for a long moment, then at the children, tangled in bedsheets and laughter and a joy that only exists when the world feels safe enough to be ridiculous in. "Today is enough," she said. And it was. Not because everything was fixed, not because the past had been forgiven, or the scars had faded, or the nightmares had stopped entirely, but because the door was open, and this time, neither of them was going to close it. In a town the world had forgotten, on a street too small to appear on any map that mattered, a family that had been broken by a lie began the slow, imperfect, ordinary work of becoming whole. Not with power, not with promises, with toast and yellow paint and a stuffed rabbit named General who outranked everyone.